You know, and early on in the space, actually, before blockchain was quite understood, there was a lot of fear around blockchains being anonymous, sources of anonymity. And as we've learned, you know, over the years, the blockchain is actually an incredibly powerful public verification tool. So as a state machine, so to speak, through which anyone can access, it offers some very interesting possibilities for identity. Identity is something, and I'll let my panelists explain more, but you know, it cuts at the very heart of many technological problems. Identity forces us to think about the trade-offs between security, proving who you say you are, and knowing that the person you're talking to is that person, and privacy, the ability to be able to interact without being surveyed, and maintaining, you know, our rights as we explore our lives online. So without further ado, I'd like my panelists to introduce themselves. Just a quick blurb about what you guys are working on, and then we'll get right into our discussion.
Hi, I'm Dave Shrier. I'm the CEO of a company called Distilled Analytics. We are building biometric identities, incorporating them into blockchain to try and help solve global problems around financial inclusion, where 3.5 billion people are underserved or unserved by our financial system, fraud, where you know, we have massive problems globally around over $1 trillion of money laundering, and other issues related to the flaws in our global identity system. I also teach at MIT and Oxford, where we're trying to incorporate academic perspectives into understanding how we can better serve humanity through new technologies like blockchain.
Hi, I'm Karamoko Dickens. I work for Perseid, which is a local Bermuda company responsible for assisting the government with building and deploying some of the technologies that David was just talking about. You know, our goal is to enable the vision for the blockchain group, which was to make sure that Bermuda could be one of the forefront jurisdictions with regards to technology and with regards to managing digital assets and things of that nature. Identity is a large part of it, and to be able to do that in an efficient fashion, but also in a privacy-preserving manner.
So I love that we have these two exciting projects on stage. You know, where we talked a little bit about fraud, the need to have a secure identity system, which makes complete sense in the concept of a government that's responsible for managing the identities and lives of its people. And then we also have the problem of folks that are outside of the nation-state system, who are stateless. You're seeing the proliferation of refugees, of people who end up living their lives out in a place other than where they started, where they can't necessarily carry credentials with them as they go. So I'd like to just dive deep into where you really see this technology solving the pain points on both sides of this equation.
Yeah, so it's helpful to take a little bit of historical context. So how did we kind of get into the mess we're in today with identity? Well, in about 450 BC, King Artaxerxes of Persia issued the first sort of identity credentials, and we're still using the same technology. We're still using some kind of physical document that says you're you, and you have certain rights that accrue to being you. And so as we've moved into creating some of these blockchain-based identity systems, we're still repeating some of those sins of the past. We're just taking photographs of passports and then uploading them into a blockchain and saying, okay, that's good enough. Now we've got blockchain identity. And the answer is it's not good enough. So what about the people who, for example, don't have passports or don't have government-issued credentials? So one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals is by 2030, the billion people in the world who have no legal identity whatsoever will have an identity. And one thing we have to address in doing that is, what do you do about someone who's illiterate? They can't read, they can't write their name, so how are they supposed to attest to their identity credentials? The good news is there's new technology that can help us solve this problem. So this little thing, the smartphone, is becoming ever more pervasive. By 2020, there will be over 500 million smartphones in Africa, the poorest continent on the planet. And this provides a new tool for formulating an identity where the person doesn't need to actively sort of input information in order for their identity to be derived from the device. The device can do it passively in the background and can do it continuously. So that's in the good news category. We can start using new technology like behavioral analytics, like biometrics, to form a new kind of identity that's more inclusive. The bad news is we've still got a lot of misapplication of technology around identity, and I'll give just 3 brief examples. So one of them is we make these great biometric identities, so we record someone's fingerprint and their facial scan, and we put it into a big database, and we call it Aadhaar, and we say we have 1.2 billion people in India who now have identities. And then we do things like we don't use good cybersecurity. And so in December, it was revealed that all 1.2 billion identities had been stolen and are available for sale on the dark web for about £5 each. So that's not good. There are other ways to address those problems of security around identity. They weren't used in the case of constructing Aadhaar. So we can learn from that example. A second example is around the new world of cryptocurrency and token trading. So, Constance was part of a group that about 4 years ago we convened at MIT that said, rather than let the US government and other governments shut down the then nascent crypto world, let's figure out compliance mechanisms that can bridge from the old world of conventional regulation to the new world of crypto. And this was something we created called the Windhover Principles that became kind of an AML KYC compliance mechanism for the industry. Okay. Sounds good, right? Now we have a way of sort of bringing the old and the new world together. The problem is, what if you have people who are very inexperienced with AML KYC trying to apply that strategy? And so I've had it shared with me by a reliable source that there are tens of millions of KYC'd accounts in the crypto exchange and wallet world that were improperly KYC'd. The people responsible for this are just hoping that no one will notice until they can clean it up. But, there's a significant cost associated with getting it wrong. So you want to make sure that you bring expertise to bear on this world of KYC and AML. And finally, there's this idea of bridging to the future. So the problem with fingerprint and facial recognition as a means of identifying people, it sounds high tech. It's actually not a very good way of securing and identifying. So for one thing, the actual security systems, like the fingerprint scanner on the iPhone 7 and the facial recognition software on the iPhone 10, were hacked within 24 to 48 hours of the release of those platforms. Okay, that's just, it's not a very good way to secure systems. But furthermore, once your fingerprints are stolen, how do you replace them? Now, if your password is stolen, you can change your password. If your fingerprint is stolen, you can't change your fingerprints. So we have to come up with new ways of identifying people that are inclusive, that are robust, that are secure, and that are not as subject to these issues of theft and fraud that even, what I'll call biometrics 1.0 are. So those are some of the challenges that we're now facing as we enter this wild world of identity. And there are several ways, in fact, that blockchain technology and artificial intelligence married to blockchain can help solve those problems.
Yes, actually, I remember a lot of people think a fingerprint is a unique thing, but what's little known is that when you wave to someone and you take a photograph, you're actually able to lift the fingerprint.
And 3D print a mold of the finger.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So and then also, as the Equifax and Facebook hacks reveal, our cybersecurity is at such a level that having these honeypots of databases of information that's collected in the traditional way actually provide a very, very valuable target for hackers, which they're able to reach. So I'd like to hear a little bit about what Bermuda is doing to bring technology to create more efficient and secure identity systems while addressing these concerns.
All right, so that's a difficult question, and following David is also difficult. So I've recently come into the space and was recently brought on to Perseid, but we've done a deep dive, and we've been attempting to mitigate some of what David just, discussed. We're looking at how identity has been implemented in India, with Adhar, or Estonia with X-Road. And we're also talking with experts around the world that are looking at sovereign identity. And those experts are from IBM and Microsoft and even the guys at Ethereum.
Would you mind explaining what sovereign identity is for the audience?
Yeah, sure. Sovereign identity, in its truest sense, is giving control of one's data to the data subject or the individual. What exists today is you have large corporations such as the Googles of the world and the Microsofts of the world, and Facebooks who actually own your identity in their form. So that identity sits in their data store, and they use it and they monetize it. So what David believes in, and I like to call David my unofficial mentor, because his book was the first book that I read to do a deep dive into this space so that I can articulate what a EID was to the government when I was a civil servant. Data is the new oil, or it's a new asset. So what we mean by that is, if you look at what's going on at Facebook and Google, they make billions of dollars each quarter based on your identities. So as our presenter just mentioned before, it's a honeypot of data that is susceptible to hacking, as with the recent Facebook hack just happened a while ago. So sovereign identity looks at this problem as a new technology, or what we call like a stack, right? So it's a method to create decentralized IDs, which the addresses, and we won't get too technical here, can be stored on a shared ledger, and they can be resolved to different pieces of that technology stack, whether that's a wallet or whether that's an agent or hub, or agents that run on hubs, which Microsoft is working on right now, where you still have some form of a data store, but it's an individual data store, and it can be stored in multiple locations, and it's secured by PKI infrastructure right now that is moving towards, and that's evolving to the goal for decentralized key management, but I haven't seen any concrete evidence that is in production right now. That's a problem that this man can help solve. However, what happens is, in order to use one's data in sovereign ID, the data subject or the individual has to give permission to the person or the body that wants to use that data. So there are a couple of ways of doing this validation. So if I'm going to an employer and they want to validate that I have a degree from a certain university, then there's a new term out there called Verifiable Credential, which I can be issued by the university based on a specific specification. And those specifications there are a few of those, but those are forming and they're being finalized right now. The idea is I can actually store this credential, which is a digital credential, which is a digital representation of my real world degree, in a wallet where I can actually provide access to this credential in a privacy-preserving manner. So when I provide it to this employer, the university doesn't know I'm actually giving it to that employer. However, that employer can validate the authenticity of this credential through a mathematical computation, right? So that's the gist of sovereign identity. So what we're doing at the Bermuda government is we realize we currently have regulations in place right now, and we have to be able to operate within that particular regime or framework. So, given we have these emerging standards and technologies that are coming out of space, we can actually look and plan towards including them in our roadmap by conversing with David, the guys at Indy Hyperledger, and we've also been in close contact with real-world implementation of a form of verifiable credentials and the decentralized identity in Canada with the British Columbia government, who is issuing virtual verifiable credentials for businesses. So we're linked into the foremost experts of the world, including an expert in this space, and her name is Kalia. She's Kalia, along with the other organizations and experts that I mentioned, are helping us come up with a way to deploy identity in Bermuda today, and that is based on PIPA and GDPR regulations, privacy regulations. And that means, that means in a high-level sense, you give consent based on through current technologies, in which one of our founding companies, which is Tsunami, they have a tool that actually does that, and they're already helping companies become compliant in Europe for GDPR. And that is to give consent to use one's data for a specific purpose based on a particular law for a particular period of time, and to have all of that auditable by, say, the internal company's internal audit or the government itself. So we're building our initial deployment based off of current technologies and current principles while building on those standards that are mature right now that I mentioned earlier. So, and with a goal to start with the foundation of sovereign identity with those technologies that are and specifications that are more mature now, and we'll build out towards those stacks that I mentioned before, whether you have your wallets, your agents, and your hubs and your shared ledgers. But we're building now in such a way that when those are more mature, we're able to decouple what we're building into those particular components.
It's very exciting. I hear a lot about pilot projects, proof of concepts around identity, and it's really heartening as a practitioner in the space to see that Bermuda and folks like you are thinking about this in such a cogent, holistic manner, drawing on all of the work that folks like David have been working on to build the frameworks around it, including GDPR, context-specific identities, and being able to leverage credentials from various third parties to really interact and really have sovereignty over who you are and what you've done and what you can prove to the world. The sovereign identity is a huge need, but we run into some problems because folks are really used to having a central authority manage their identities. How are you guys, and we're running out of time, but I would want to talk about how are we going to leverage this idea of independence and control over your identities, the ability to wield that identity out into the world as you interact with your university, your employer, to get a mortgage, while dealing with some of the pain points in user-managed identities.
Yeah, well, it's a non-trivial problem, as you correctly point out.
It's a difficult question.
Yeah, and there are kind of two answers to the question. So the one that I think is something that just needs to be done is better education about your identity and your identity assets and the risks that are associated with it. So 50 years ago we didn't think about eating bad food and drinking bad soda and failing to exercise. We kind of lived a fairly unhealthy diet and exercise life, but through a series of educational campaigns, people began to learn the value of exercise and good nutrition. And so similarly, we need to have a healthy identity. So part of it is simply education. And I say simply, straightforward to talk about, difficult to execute at scale, but necessary. The other part of it is we can use technology to make this easier. So the kinds of identities that we're building, and so we're working with Shift and Tsunami on Bermuda's opportunity to leapfrog into next generation identity. Is what if the system automatically understood you and your preferences and would just do things for you as if it were you? So artificial intelligence is getting smarter and smarter, and it can begin to learn your preferences and kind of adapt around your circumstances to at least carry things part of the way so that you don't have to carry the mental burden of thinking about, do I want to permission or depermission this identity asset here or there? Carried a step further, we even could have identity agents. So when we think about self-sovereign digital identity, when we think about what something like GDPR means, which is I can give permission around my identity or identity attributes, and I can take it back. I have the right to be forgotten. What if we had agents that would act on our behalf to help us do things that we wanted to do with our identity, like apply for a job, get an apartment, get a loan for a house or a car. And so that's part of this sort of new future that we're building for. But what I'm excited about with the incorporation of blockchain technology into the identity discussion is that we can also cut down on the repeated effort. So today, hundreds of financial institutions and other institutions will duplicate work in order to construct and verify identity. And when we use these decentralized systems and someone has control over their own identity attributes, they then can give permission, so you get KYC'd once, and then you just give permission each time you want someone to see your information. So it accelerates speed and reduces cost. And so that's pretty exciting.
So I'd like to hear from you, but I also want to know, does Bermuda have any plans to open up EID to international businesses like Estonia has?
Ooh, that's a tough question. I can speak to what Premier Bird has already said, and that was a yes. It's yes to the last question. Working towards that is a difficult task, but we'll work with David to attempt to make that happen. First, from a individual perspective, the convenience to use these type of identifications is one of the factors that can help foster adoption. However, the opportunity to participate in using one's own data from a monetary standpoint is very, very encouraging. These types of ideas are already out there saying that, okay, if with sovereign identity you can actually generate money with your own identity, right? And those are very nascent or immature right now, but if data is an asset and Microsoft and Google and those guys are already making money off of your data, why can't you? So in terms of adoption, that's one of the options that's out there. From a business standpoint, as David mentioned, the ability to very efficiently validate a entity, or what we call an enterprise or an individual that has gone through AML KYC at another entity. So say for example, if a credential of some sort is issued by the BMA, which can be programmatically confirmed by a bank in a programmatic manner with systems. Those are the opportunities that are out there to decrease costs for the private sector, right? How that will be done and the regulations that need to be formed and deployed based on that. We have an opportunity to talk to other governments, such as those that are in Canada or those experts that are helping contribute to this space, such as those from DC, the Department of Homeland Security in the U.S. They're helping to contribute to this. So eventually, speaking with those experts from a regulatory standpoint around the world in terms of how they plan on doing it, that can also help us roll out a regime which will make our business or our private sector feel comfortable in using these, credentials in this manner, so we can achieve the efficiencies. So that's just a couple of different ways that can foster adoption here.
Yeah. Well, this is very exciting. Blockchain identity promises the ability to not only control your identity and wield that identity throughout the world, but actually leverage in the richness that's created by all of our data. So please keep an eye on these projects and feel free to talk to our panelists after our talk at the break. Thank you.
Thank you.